Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And my guest this evening is Chris Frazer. Chris is a member of the Communist Party of Canada. He is an educator by day and a drag performer by night. And yes, we are here to talk about queer liberation, homo nationalism, imperialism, transphobia, biphobia, identity politics versus the class struggle. And just before we get into the interview, last September was Bisexual Awareness Week, also known as #BiWeek, which is held through September the 16th to the 23rd, and it was also Celebrate Bisexuality Day, which is observed September the 23rd. And last November 20th of this month was International Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is a day which memorializes those who have been murdered as a result of transphobia and other institutional transphobic laws. And yep. And then one last thing before I get into the interview is I want to give a special shout out to Trish of Faint Signals from Vega, Sandy of Left of Box, and Luna Oy and her romantic partner and comrade EJ, and Moxie and Kieran of Red Life podcast. So Chris, first of all, thank you for joining me today.
You're very welcome, Youri. Thanks for having me.
It's an honor to have you. And so Chris, my first question and I want to ask you is, what is heteronormative or heteronormativity, and how is the capitalist system and institutional classism explicitly linked to it?
Well, I'm going to say, first of all, with respect to heteronormativity, this is simply the imposition of system of values that privilege heterosexual relationships, and that becomes the norm. And I would also say it goes beyond that, because it erases any other possible forms of sexual orientation, or in fact, gender orientation as well. So why impose, or why does heteronormativity function in this way? And it's got everything to do with property relations and the private expropriation of property relations. It's probably a little harder to unpack just because it's become so disguised and overlaid in contemporary society. But I'm a university professor. I teach the history of colonial Latin America. And I'll tell you that that the construction of gendered and sexual relations was absolutely based on patriarchal values and an understanding that women were to be the vessels for the transfer of property from father to son. That's what marriage was about. That's what heterosexuality was about. And it was purely about transferring the appropriation of wealth from others and protecting it in that way. And so that's why women were policed. In colonial New Spain, for example, women, wealthy women, couldn't go out in the daytime or anytime without a male family member chaperoning them, whether it was their son, cousin, father, uncle, grandfather, whoever. And if they did, they were considered to be a dishonored woman, and you could be subject to all kinds of penalties for that. This is how heteronormativity becomes heteronormativity, and quite often it's simply self-selected because people choose not to violate it because the penalties are going to be so severe. So, and Catholic Church was very strict about policing that, and women died in pretty horrible ways when they violated that norm at the stake or on the rack or in other ways. So heteronormativity comes into existence for the very reasons of protecting private capital, and it's policed that way in order to. Sometimes it becomes just a reflex. People participate because they don't really realize there's any other options, and in that way, queer people become a threat to the stability of capitalism. So this is also the root of homophobia. In fact, I go so far as to say that the existence of homophobia is intimately linked to the existence of misogyny. The liberation of women, I think, is a precondition for the liberation of queer people. And the precondition for the liberation of all of the above is the abolition of capitalism.
Wow, and so it's safe to say that heteronormativity is also explicitly linked to institutional patriarchy and sexism.
Yep. It can't be separated from that. Absolutely not. So the longer people cling to the notion that it's normal to be heterosexual, you actually contribute to prolonging the life of capitalism and patriarchy.
Fantastic, and that's a perfect segue then to this question, which is, what to you is queer liberation from a radical Marxist perspective?
I'm going to begin with talking about homonationalism, actually, because when homonationalism
go right ahead. That was even one of my questions, which is, what is homonationalism?
I think we can't explain that without understanding homonationalism. It's about what are you liberating yourself from, and the current round of queer liberation is in conflict with the politics of homonationalism. So here in Canada, queer liberation, queer oppression has long, deep, very deep roots, and it was pretty much lumped into, there was not much distinction between various kinds of queer people. So, there were gay and then there were gay. So there's a much bigger range than that as we understand now. But what it meant back in the day was that any non-heteronormative behavior was categorized as gay or homosexual and therefore illegal or immoral. And this was a designation imposed on us by the state. And it has its own reasons for doing that, but for the most part, it's about policing the forms of sexuality that are acceptable and that will sustain heteronormative behavior. So you can't have sex outside of the missionary position is the basic rule. And why? Because that's the basic position for producing children, and that's part of the process of inheritance. Okay. So all of that was cause for criminalizing homosexuality. I was born in Canada illegal. I was born a criminal because of who I am.
Yeah, wow.
So queer liberation's always been important. Now, 69 happens, and you see the emergence of what was then called the gay liberation movement. And it didn't take long for that movement to begin excluding the least desirable, least presentable members of the LGBTQ community. In fact, you could not add the T or the Q, and trans people, queer people, anybody who didn't conform to sort of this homo-nationalism was pretty much driven out of the early gay liberation movement, because this also affected people who performed drag, because we were seen as an embarrassment to cisgendered, white, middle-class male gays. Because now, with decriminalization of homosexuality, they could benefit. They get to benefit from civil marriage and legalization of gay marriage, and from being in opposition to the legislative agenda of the state, now they're in support of it. And this then leads them into support of the state, period. And their hopes for some kind of equality all now depend on being acceptable to the bourgeois state. That's homonationalism. That homonationalism also participates in the oppression and persecution of queer people. So you actually have a class division within the queer community. Those who are willing to end the practice of social solidarity amongst oppressed people and side with the oppressor. And this also happens for financial reasons, because that narrow band of the LGBTQ community is also where most of the money is. So what do you see? You see banks and corporations all competing to attract that money. And you can't do it when you're a homophobic asshole. explicitly.
Exactly.
So you tone it down. And for a week out of the year, you put rainbow flags up on your businesses and you do everything to be nice to your homosexual workers and all the rest of it. And then that week ends and you're back to normal 51, the normal 51 weeks. And that's that you don't really give a shit about the gay community, except that you got a whole bunch of their money during Pride Week. That's homo nationalism. So it doesn't serve the interests of the queer community. It does nothing to promote queer liberation. It does everything to stabilize acceptance for middle class, normal looking gay white guys, almost always white guys, and to hell with the rest. So that's why we still have epidemics of trans murders. It's why we still have various forms of repression against people of color in the queer community. They're not experiencing much equality, and so on down the list. So there's a hierarchy of who matters in the queer community, and in a homo national framework, it's a very small group of people: white, middle class, cisgendered, gay males, and then the rest of us have to find our own way. So queer liberation wants to move past that. We want to move into a society where we no longer face the oppression based on capitalist patriarchy. So we want to root that out, and then really let's get to a social system where it actually doesn't matter who you love, who you want to have sexual relations with. It should be, well, early radicals promoted the idea of free love, and I'm not sure that they understood it in quite the same way, but I think that's really still what we're talking about. You should be free to love your fellow human beings, and the capitalist system finds a million ways to keep you from doing that. In fact, not just to keep you from doing it, but they actively encourage you to hate people. It's a lot easier to hate people if you become a cop or a soldier.
And that is a perfect, and that's a perfect segue then to can you explain more? You sort of got into it when talking about homo nationalism. Can you explain rainbow capitalism and why? And go ahead.
Sure. No, you go ahead. Finish your question.
Oh, yeah. So explain rainbow capitalism and why queer liberationists and their straight cisgendered allies should reject rainbow capitalism. What is pinkwashing and who's guilty of it? And I know that you're probably going to talk about the police. You already talked about corporations, the military, and then states like Israel, which on the books, they have some gay friendly policies, but go ahead.
Sure. So so rainbow capitalism is really just a sudden realization that there's money to be made by being friendly to the queer community. Who knew?
And there are aspects of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, who knew that all these gay guys had a lot of money when we were busy putting them in jail, right? If we'd only known that, then we'd have charged them more bail and then not arrested them again. So it's the limited amount of reforms that have created the possibility. Since the 1960s, most states in the advanced capitalist world have created a system of legislation that permits wider acceptance of gay people. And then that in turn has to a limited extent inserted itself into every workplace. So gay people tend to feel a lot more comfortable about coming out, not universally, but it happens more and more often now. A lot of workplaces will also have equity training programs, anti-oppression training programs, how to be nice to your marginal colleagues, and all this other stuff. And part of it is to create this. There is some level of sincerity. I mean, some people do think that you shouldn't be mean to others in the workplace. And actually, it's not even a real question. Not about mean. It's about the level of exploitation. You can be pretty nice and still exploit people, but
exactly.
But then that's. So, but they want to be able to portray these companies and even states really want to be able to portray themselves as friends and allies of the queer community. And so they do kind of the minimum level of things that are necessary in order to create that public image. So this is what happens during Pride Week. And you see all kinds of corporations wanting to submit floats to a pride parade, for example, and they're going to put all the rainbow flags on it, and they're going to allow their queer employees to wear rainbow colored themes on the float and all this, and it's really just advertising. It's saying, come and do business with us. See, all you gay people who are watching the Pride Parade, we're gay friendly. And so you can come and put your money in our bank, or you can come and buy our products, and you can even buy them from a gay person, honestly, right? It's just wonderful. This is gay capitalism. But like I said, after Pride Week is over, so is the party. And you go back to the normal, regular social relations of work, employer and exploited. So it really doesn't push the ball forward at all. And it's in fact designed to maintain a status quo where there's a pipeline of money from the relatively affluent members of the gay community into the corporate sector. And the rest of it, they really don't give a shit about. The fact is that we still have 50% of our 50% of homeless people in this country are queer youth. They don't have homes. They still get kicked out of their homes. And if you get kicked out of your homes, you're not getting a job at a rainbow corporation at all. And there's not a rainbow corporation anywhere in North America that is doing anything to help the problems of homelessness amongst LGBTQ youth or the problems of addiction amongst the LGBT community. None of that. We now have, the pandemic has closed the only bar we had dedicated to the queer community in Halifax, and it was where we performed. And so people like myself found ourselves temporarily without a stage. Do you think there was any one of these big corporations that offered to step up and to provide the capital necessary to open a new space for queer people? Nope. None of them have. They don't give a shit. If we do, the first thing that'll happen is that they'll want to know if they can sell their beer in our bar. And my answer will be, go fuck yourself. So you weren't there to help us when we're struggling during the pandemic. Why should we think that you're sincere about that now? Because they're not. They're just, if they can make money from us, then they will. As soon as we're not a source of revenue, I will guarantee you we go back to the street. That's rainbow capitalism.
And rainbow capitalism, talk a bit more about pinkwashing, because it sounds to me as if that's exactly what those big businesses who come out when it's when it's Pride, a bank or a big multinational corporation which is exploiting people for cheap labor overseas. It sounds to me as if that's pinkwashing. And talk about how the police are part of that pinkwashing, and why. And why someone such as yourself will reject having the police even be part of Pride events.
Yeah. The pinkwashing and the rainbow capitalism are two sides of the same coin, and it is about deceiving people into thinking that that these organizations or these nations are in some way progressive, and at the very least not homophobic. So pinkwashing gets used pretty efficiently by a lot of capitalist states, imperialist states in particular, and the question of Israel is actually the perfect perfect example to use. But every year, well, I'm going to say the last few years in particular, I'm mostly familiar with the political struggles around Halifax Pride. Mm-hmm. But there's a number of us, myself included, who had been involved in, first of all, organizing an alternative march. We named it the Dyke and Trans March, and it happens in the same week as the Pride Parade. But our thing was that no police. We do not welcome police in our parade, and when they try to protect it, we don't want their protection because they aren't our protectors. They arrest and harass and oppress queer people. But the police want to be in the parade because they want to be pinkwashed. They want to be able to disguise what their real function is in a capitalist society. The arguments that erupted around that go most recently back to the appearance of Black Lives Matter at the Pride Parade in Toronto, maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, where they interrupted the parade and sat down in the middle of the road and made the parade stop until the Pride organizers met with them and acted on the demands that Black Lives Matter had, which had all to do with genuine inclusion into Halifax Pride, because they were being systematically excluded from any meaningful participation. And I was shocked. I was really shocked to hear things coming out of the mouths of people I'd known for a long time who said, well, what do those Black people have to do with Pride? It's like, what? You say their problems with the police are not the problems of gay people. And I think, you know that there are Black gay people, yes? Do you? Do you really know this? And also, you know that the police, when they're carding them on the streets, which is an illegal activity in Canada, but cops do it all the time, when they're doing street checks and asking for their identifications, they're not asking first, do you have a gay card also? Because if you have a gay card, we won't frisk you and we won't arrest you because we know you're one of the good gays.
Wow.
Yes. So as long as any Black person is subject to that kind of police harassment and discrimination, then yes, we have to take a stand with Black Lives Matter, because these are our brothers and sisters. And as long as they're oppressed, whether it's being for Black or gay, you got to know that it won't be very long before those police come back knocking on our doors too. So this is really just about bringing the principle of solidarity back into the Pride community. We practice solidarity and support each other. This is how we survive. It's how we've always survived. And I actually find it quite dangerous, because once you start chopping up the queer community into groups that matter and groups that don't matter, when the police come knocking, that makes us all really vulnerable in the long run. So if you don't stand up and push back and stand side by side and practice solidarity with the most exploited, most oppressed members of our community, you are actively participating in the eventual dismantlement of that community.
Yeah.
Because I think of the very famous poem. Was it Niebuhr or somebody during the Nazis, a Lutheran minister who wrote this very famous poem. First they came for the communists, but I didn't protest because I wasn't a communist. And this is exactly what I think of when I think about how pinkwashing and rainbow capitalism are being used to break apart that practice of solidarity. They encourage you to think about yourself. It's the ultimate selfishness, which is really what capitalism is really all about. It's about being selfish and just getting yours back. But if you grow up poor and without, you know how important it is to share. So yeah, so this is why I choose not to participate in the pinkwashing, and I call it out every time I can, and also rainbow capitalism. The pinkwashing also is happening also with Israel. And I am going to speak about this specifically now, because it's becoming increasingly obvious that that this is an apartheid state that is engaged in daily, minute by minute violations of most basic human rights of Palestinian people. And it's attracting criticism, rightly so, increasing criticism. And it's been quite encouraging to see opposition to Israeli apartheid from some pretty surprising corners recently. the Miss Universe pageant of all places. I think one or two contestants, including from the candidate from Greece, just said, "No, I'm not going because of what they're doing." You know. Well, Israel followed a very deliberate policy of muting criticism by saying, "Well, look, we're the only safe place in the Middle East for gay people." Again, that was news to me.
And the only one that practices some kind of form of feminism, right? Compared to all of these.
Yeah. So what they're really saying is that you can have your equality and have a good time as a gay person in Israel as long as you're willing to pick up a rifle and kill a Palestinian. And I'm sorry, that's not a club I'm willing to belong to. So, and if you're a gay person and you're trying to belong to that club, I'm your enemy. There is no line to cross here. It is just not a line, period, you're going to cross. So the time has passed that I think that we can close our eyes any longer to countries that use our sexuality to disguise or cover up their crimes against humanity. We cannot allow that to happen. So it can be really uncomfortable, because I know you're going to get called an anti-Semite for doing that. And I think, it's just like all, but guess what? Guess who's not, guess who's all, we're used to being, to dealing with slurs. I have book length slurs. You want to call me a slur? Here's your list. Take a pick. I've been vaccinated against those kinds of slurs. I don't care. You can call me an anti-Semite all you want. I'd rather be called an anti-Semite than be an active participant in the act of genocide. So that's the pinkwashing side. And one other one is that if you look at advertising for certain weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, when they advertise their warplanes or whatever else they're producing for war, it's fascinating to see the number of rainbow flags that they slap all over their advertising. So it's like, feel good about being bombed to oblivion, because at least this bomb has a rainbow flag on it. It's for a good cause, right? You're dying for the cause of gay equality somewhere in the West. And I'm sure that brings a lot of comfort to people in Yemen or Iraq or wherever, right? Sorry, guys.
but what's also hilarious, I have to jump in to say is that what's hilarious about the military co-opting queer civil rights is that okay, maybe queer friendly legislation is better in the US or Canada or Western Europe compared to Russia or Iran and so forth, but the people that the US is supporting, you mentioned this, the constant bombardment of Yemen or the war in or the Western imperial Israeli war in Syria, is that the forces that the West are supporting in those countries, the Saudi, Qatari, UAE forces are the most are some of the most reactionary, anti-queer nations on the face of Earth. Talk a bit more about that.
Well, all I'll say is I guarantee you that that when Saudi Arabia is busy throwing all those rainbow-themed bombs on Yemeni people, that at the same time, this does not mean that you're going to be able to stroll down any street in Riyadh in friggin' 6-inch heels. Ain't going to happen. So it's just a lie. It is a bold lie, and then it just gets repackaged and sold back to us as a way of taking the edge of any criticism of countries like Saudi Arabia. But in the meantime, I guarantee you those bombs aren't asking any questions about the sexual orientation of any of the people who they're dropping on. So they're killing straight people, they're killing gay people. It's indiscriminate. So if you're okay with the indiscriminate killing of human beings, then okay, sure, by all means. Support rainbow capitalism and pinkwashing, but you need to understand what you're doing is engaging in support for the murder of human beings. So
what would you say to to somebody in the U.S., which it doesn't have a draft anymore, but there is very much an economic draft that goes on in which you have a struggling trans person who needs health insurance, is being deprived of the life to liberty, pursuit of happiness, and all of that. And so they feel that the military is their only avenue, and the military is now advertising that, hey, you can be openly trans in the military, and hey, we're waging a war against a country, the Taliban, which is explicitly anti-queer. And how would you dissuade a trans person or anyone from within the queer community? No, do not go into the military.
They do this. It's really they're very explicit about it too. I mean, they will pay for, the United States will now pay for your transition. The United States military pays for your gender reassignment surgery. So, and this is in a country where you can't even use bathrooms if you're a trans person. You can't even use the gendered bathrooms, but you can go into the military and get your surgery paid for and go overseas and kill. The contradictions are just
mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling. I actually find it hard to argue, I don't know that there's a really great argument to dissuade trans people from taking advantage of that opportunity. There just isn't, because what are they going to do? Where are they going to get access to it? What the United States does is insidious. They condemn trans people to a life of misery one way or the other. It's crappy to go into the military. It's crappy to live in Georgia too. So the only thing I ever would say is that struggle for something better, and that better is really, for me. I made this decision a really long time ago. I joined the goddamn Communist Party, and because I eventually understood that as much as I might have wanted to take advantage of the offering of an education in the Canadian military, it really wasn't a road that I was prepared to go to, because there's a quid pro quo. There is always this isn't generosity, this isn't charity. This is, we'll provide you with something that you need, but you have to become obedient and willing to kill. I've never been a particularly obedient person my whole life.
And in the end, and also going into the military, all of those, all of those countries which the settler colonial states of Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, and their allies, and that does not, the destruction of Libya, the destruction of Iraq, the ongoing, destruction of Palestine and so forth, that does not advance queer liberation. And the coup that took place in Ukraine against big bad Ukrainian people of a Russian background, and against Putin, that does not advance queer liberation, right?
Nope. Not at all. It just simply, it might provide a solution for an individual, but it does not do anything to alter the social reality for the community itself. And so, you got people who are going into the military in the USA because now they're going to get their transition paid for, but there are also people outside of the military. And actually, by the way, trans veterans who are now living on the streets in the USA. So, yeah, sure, you can go get your surgery paid for, but you still have a 50% chance of ending up in the streets and unemployed with your transitioned body. So there's actually no real benefit that's permanent or sufficiently broad or long term. It's an illusion, and it's an illusion that's that you're gonna pay a very heavy price for in the end.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's it.
And can you talk about how there are some about how some right wingers are trying to co-opt queer the grievances of queer people to advance Islam to advance Islamophobia. Oh. One of the great examples of that is one of the great examples of that would be Geert Wilders in Holland. Yeah. And the late Pim Fortuyn, a libertarian who often, they use the legitimate grievances of homophobia, which exists in Islamic communities within Holland and outside. So they use, queer civil rights as a way to advance Islamophobia, and basically also advance, what I call, liberal bigotry.
Yep. So there are three things. One, I'm just going to point to the number of Islamic queer people that I know in my own personal life, and so I just call them out on that shit straight up. You say, yeah, well, they exist, they're here, and they're still Islamic. So if a queer person can find a place within their Islamic community and still remain faithful to Islam, then I would say that that's not a problem of homophobia in Islam. That's a political problem within a state or a community. That's the first thing. The second thing is these are people who have absolutely zero understanding of history. Because if you wanna push back further into earlier phases of Islam, you're going to find all kinds of homosexuality accepted within the Islamic world. Tons of it. And it's not until the colonization of the Islamic world by European imperialism, which then smuggles in its own hatreds, they begin to, part of that process of colonization is the destruction of old political legal systems and the imposition of those that are colonial and controlled by the colonial states. And so they begin distributing benefits and privileges based on the degree to which you are able to practice the values of imperialism. And the values of imperialism in the 19th century were absolutely homophobic, racist, and misogynist. And so that's actually how those values found their way into Islamic culture and then emerged in the 20th century. So I'm going to argue really, really, really vigorously that these are not values intrinsic to Islam, not in the slightest. So they've been smuggled in. Some elements in the Islamic world have found it politically convenient to embrace them. But does this define Islam? The answer is no, capital N, capital O. So this just a cynical manipulation by right wingers, and I've seen it most recently in the case of Milos Yiannopoulos.
I wasn't even going to mention that scumbag's name, but talk a bit more. Yeah, talk a bit more about that. The former Breitbart editor.
I've been quite enjoying Milo's self. He's been a spectacular in his self-destruction. He just threw his engagement ring into the ocean and all this other shit. But he was chirping the queer community, and signing on with Richard Spencer and the rest of those neo-Nazis and attempting to find a place for, and there were some queer people who were buying into it, right? But this is just the case of look, just because you're oppressed doesn't mean you have principles. And it's just that unprincipled people manage to do the most awful things in order to lift themselves out of their crappy existence. And Milos Yiannopoulos is one of those. So he found a way. He made his own deal with capitalism's secular devil, and made a name for himself. But I guarantee you, he also has significantly narrowed down the field of potential suitors, because most queer men are probably going to puke their guts out before they would even seriously consider any kind of a relationship with Milos Yiannopoulos, because he will screw you in the end. And that's what they do. And the thing about Milos is that his usefulness of his service to the neo-Nazis has pretty much been spent. And do you see any of those guys hanging around to comfort Milos Yiannopoulos? Not a single one of them. They've dumped that guy as fast as they could because he's no longer useful. And this, by the way, brings you back full circle to why all of the rest of this. Do you think Israel would have any use for its gays if it wasn't politically expedient? Not on your life. You think any corporation is going to continue, its pride celebrations if they stop making money from the queer community? Not on your life. This is the test. Do they really care about you? Think about what they lose as most important to them, and will that still keep them on your side? Nope, it isn't going to. So it's fake, it's an illusion, and it will send you back into the corner of oppression at the end of the day. So it's all a fraud and an illusion.
And going back to homo nationalism, does homo nationalism also mean that we advance Western queer rights at the expense of the of the country that the imperial state is targeting for the moment?
Yeah, we do, and in fact, there's a stream of that right across the queer community. I think we wrongly assume that other cultures practice and understand homosexuality in the same way. I actually just had this conversation with a very good friend of mine, and if I may, we were just having a conversation about tops and bottoms, and I'm not sure if I need to explain that or not. But they were saying, gays in general are tops or bottoms, and some are switches, and I said, well, that's true in our culture. We tend to function on that kind of a spectrum. But I'm a Latin Americanist as an academic. That's my specialty. And if you travel anywhere in Latin America, you quickly begin to understand that in many Latin American contexts, the homosexual is simply the bottom. If you're active and on the top, you're still considered to be straight. So this notion,
actually, can you explain a bit more about that? I find that quite, yeah.
Well, there's a phrase. It's a colloquial phrase in Mexico. Usually, it gets used to refer to mestizo people, but they refer themselves as los chingados, which means we're the fucked ones. But it's that same logic that applies in sexual orientation. It's starting to change a little bit because of the influence of the imperialist culture, which. But gay people, the working definition of gay person, a gay man, is that you're the receiver, you're the passive receiver. If you're active, you're macho, you're masculine, you're a guy, okay? But if you are on the receiving end, that is what constitutes la jota, the gay, right? You're the bottom. That's the gay. So we can't assume anything. Just quit assuming. Right? It's just that here in North America, first of all, or even in Europe, homosexuality. Actually, this is actually a good correlation. It was also the same in 16th or 17th century Europe. Exactly the same. Why do you think the laws were not? There's hardly any laws saying we ban homosexuality. Almost all the laws ban sodomy. They're anti-sodomy laws. And it applies to women also in the medieval context. So if you're giving somebody a blowjob, you're committing sodomy. Yeah. The problem in Christian-dominated culture, and the problem with using sex as a means to transfer wealth from father to son, is that if you engage in sexuality that doesn't serve that purpose, it should not be legal. It's criminalized. So sodomy was simply anything, any form of intercourse, whether it was oral intercourse or anal intercourse, that was outside of that framework. And eventually that becomes identified with the homosexual. A sodomite becomes the homosexual in the 19th century. That understanding of homosexuality was at the heart of the of English culture during the colonial period. Is at the heart of Spanish and Portuguese culture during the colonial period. At the heart of Dutch culture when they were busy, colonizing in the West. All of them had the same understanding of the sodomite. So those laws get embedded at the earliest moments right across the North and South America. If you go to Texas, it's still illegal in Texas, and they still have, and it's called the Sodomy Laws. They're not called the homosexuality laws. When I did grad school in Rhode Island, 2001, I think they finally repealed the sodomy laws in Rhode Island. And that meant, so the newspapers actually had to do a translation. This means that gays are liberated. so I had to imagine all of the heterosexual sodomites celebrating too and say, no, that's not about you. But originally, the definition, the thing that was immoral was nothing called homosexuality. It was sodomy. So it evolves. It evolves in North America in a different way. It evolves in Europe in a different way. But in Latin America, it remains much, much closer to the original intent. So you can still be in South America, in not all places, but in many still, you can still be the top. You can still be the active partner, and it will not impair your sexual orientation in any way, shape, or form. You will still be fully respected in your community. You can even be open about it, and nobody will give a shit. The only one who's going to pay the penalty is the bottom, the one who's receiving, and that's the homosexual. So we have to be really careful about when we're practicing our international. I'm going to say I'm not a homo nationalist, I'm a homo internationalist. And so when I'm practicing that level of internationalism, I also have to be aware and respectful of the way that other cultures understand and then define and practice their sexual orientations. And that's for them to practice and me to observe and respect and to incorporate that understanding into my practice as well. So you just can't assume stuff. Always better to ask.
Exactly, and it seems as it seems is it safe to say that that the West using homo nationalism is their way of just being belligerent Western chauvinists towards whatever is the targeted country that they want to further colonize.
You know, we saw this, the first big experiment with all this happened against Russia. And there was some pretty awful stuff happening in Russia. It was in the early 2000s, so 2004, 2005. There were these sort of neo-Nazis who were gay hunting and doing really awful things, torturing people that they captured, and then videotaping and posting this shit. And there are also some dubious laws in the Russian legal system around homosexuality, but it's not anything that's all that out of the ordinary. I would say that actually homophobia has gotten worse since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It never happened in that way.
Talk about that, yeah.
Well, we'll come back to that in a second, but I noticed very much that suddenly there was this coordinated campaign to denounce Russia and Putin as homophobes, right? And this was all about mobilizing queer support for the Cold War, okay? And without in any way encouraging anybody to look any deeper into what was actually going on. And it happened also the same way in the feminist community too, around the riot girls, okay? So it's all about creating this image of a misogynist, homophobic Russia. And I'm surprised they haven't done it with race yet either, quite frankly. So, but it gets actively mobilized. So it uses this to generate support for Cold War politics. So, but you want to know about Russia, right?
Yes.
And the Soviet Union. Well, the first thing I always tell people is that one of the first things that Lenin and the old Bolsheviks did in 1919 was to decriminalize homosexuality. They just did it. It was recriminalized in 1932 or 1933 under Stalin, and that's a whole separate discussion. And I think that this is, for me, I do think we were sold out, and it was. The argument was that there was an uptick towards a more sort of conservative morality, and so Stalin's trying to whatever he was doing, but it ends up being done on the backs of queer people, and that was unfortunate. However, it's not like there was an organized campaign of oppression against it. You just didn't have the legalization. So there was always the possibility of engaging in some kind of a relationship. But there's also precursors to all of this, and I want to say that the first decriminalization of sodomy actually was Napoleon Bonaparte. And when he created the French Empire, the Napoleonic Empire in Europe, one of the first things that he did was to introduce civil codes, which are still the basis for much of the legal structures across the continent of Europe and even North America.
Due to his due to his influence of Enlightenment values, secularism, separation between
secularism, all of this stuff. And I'm not, by the way, trying to paint Napoleon as a good guy, because he had more than his fair share of warts. But this is just one. This is one of the things that happened, and I'm not saying even that it was planned, but the civil codes were developed in revolutionary France in the late 18th century, and one of the things those civil codes did was to remove references to sodomy as a crime. So it just wasn't. I don't know. Maybe this explains a lot about France these days too. Who knows? But it actually took conscious effort on the part of emerging states in the 19th century in Europe to actually recriminalize. So that was a conscious thing, right? It wasn't just an inheritance. But there is a tradition of that, and it just isn't well known because much of that history has been covered up, and it's taken some digging to begin uncovering it. And this notion that it was early, I mean, Lenin did ask the question. He says, "Why should we be concerned about this? Even if it's morally dubious, what actual harm does it cause?" And his thinking was none. So why should we be concerned with criminalizing it? Why should we be concerned with oppressing it? So it was not.
So even though, sorry, there seems to be an echo going on my end, so apologies for that. So during the time of the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, even if it wasn't this queer utopia, this queer liberation utopia, because of their secularism, there you could argue that the destruction of communism in the Eastern Bloc and the USSR was more of a setback for queer liberation, because look at what we see now in Eastern Europe and Russia. We have rival oligarchs at each other's throats. We have rival far-right movements at each other's throats. We do have the far right who lionize Nazi collaborators and Nazi war criminals, like what we have in Ukraine and so forth. So again, this kind of gets to the heart of why queer liberationists need to be against imperialism, right?
Yep.
And homo nationalism.
What the West, if I use that term loosely, I prefer the imperial core, the imperialist nations, to the term West. So what they've done really well is to reduce homosexuality, the liberation of homosexuals, to an ideological thing, an idea that you need to treat these people better. You just need not to discriminate them, right? But it's never really named. It's just that you shouldn't be homophobic. Okay, fine. That's good, but I'll guarantee you what every queer person needs is guarantee of the right to work, to an income, to an education, to home, to be fed. Because you can have people treat you nicely, not hate you for your homosexuality, but still fucking starve in the streets.
Exactly.
And that is what's happening, okay, in the former Soviet Union. And it's what the obverse is true. If you want to compare the fate of homosexuals in the USSR during the 1960s to 1990, well, and then compare that to Canada. Well, Canada between 1960 and 1990 carried out a massive purge of its civil service. Hundreds of thousands of civil servants were dismissed because of suspicion of homosexuality, deprived of their jobs. And this is even after the alleged decriminalization of homosexuality in Canada in 1969. I'm going to tell you a dirty little secret: it never happened. There's not one of those laws was ever removed from the book, and they're still operational. And there were still raids being carried out on gay bathhouses, police still arresting homosexuals in parks, and all of that. It still goes on to this day.
Under both Pierre Trudeau and Brian Mulroney of the Progressive Conservatives.
Oh yeah, under all of them. And they're busy saying, we support gays and we're going to finance the Rainbow Railroad. There's this group called the Rainbow Railroad that gets gets money from our federal government to provide escape routes for homosexuals from Eastern Europe. And to what? Bring them here, where now they're still going to be subject to all the bullshit that currently exists. But was there a similar purge in the Soviet Union of civil servants between 1960 and 1990? Not one. Who got denied housing in the USSR because of their sexuality? Nobody. Who lost their jobs in the USSR because of their sexuality? Nobody. So when we're talking about gay rights as a human right, we're not talking just about the right to be gay. What we're talking about is the right to have the same thing as everybody else, the guarantee to job, to housing, to having proper and affordable food, to having education for your kids, to have a healthcare system. That's what gay rights as a human right is all about. It's about those things and not being denied them because of your sexual orientation. The USSR did that without ever proclaiming that gay rights are human rights. And yes, you were going to face civil discrimination. People were going to probably be biased against you, and you definitely were going to have a hard time in many different situations, but you weren't going to lose your job. You weren't going to lose your home. You weren't going to find yourself so completely vulnerable that you would do anything to survive. That shit didn't happen in the Soviet Union between 60 and 90 because you were gay. It sure as hell did happen in North America. So if I'm going to be asked which was the better social system for gay people, unequivocally was the Soviet Union. Now people say, well, it's collapsed now. And I say, okay, I'll give you another example. Let's look at Cuba. Cuba gets accused of putting people into gay people into work camps in the 1960s, and that's true. It was a terrible mistake. But what really impresses me is that Castro talked about how wrong they were. They admit they were wrong. They just didn't understand I'm okay with people who are prepared to rethink how they behaved and the things that they did. That's to me the hallmark of a really good communist. We're not perfect. What we do is we try something that we think will work, and if it doesn't work, then we stand back from it and we admit that and we try it again. So, and Cuba has shown a remarkable degree of flexibility with respect to its queer population. As far as I know, they're the only country, maybe even in the world, but certainly in the Western Hemisphere, that provides absolutely free supports for sex reassignment surgery. You get your hormones for free, you get your surgery for free, and you're guaranteed all of the same civil and social rights as anybody else in Cuba.
Are gay conversion therapies also banned in Cuba? Because the West still practice because the West and countries that are trying to be more like the West still gay conversion therapy is still on the books.
Yeah, I tell them they're doing gay conversion therapy wrong. It's not about making gay people straight. It's about making straight people gay, and it's never going to work. So, when Cuba went through the special period, right, from 1990 to 2000, 1997. Castro suggested that maybe they should have the May Day parade with drag queens in the lead. And they did. And this was a message. This was absolutely a message to the rest of the Cuban population that we got to set aside whatever petty discriminations you have, because we're all in this fucking shit together, and we won't get out of it unless we get out of it together. So solidarity was the key word. And I remember how I was so happy when I saw images from the May Day parade, all these beautiful drag queens, the full width of the boulevard in Havana, carrying the front banner for May Day. This is the workers' holiday. Man, I just thought, Cuba gets it, and this is in their worst moment. But then I think about the comparison for me is now having watched the USA go through arguably some of its worst moments in its history in the last few years. I don't know.
But then how do you deal with the dilemma of of somebody like Putin who passes anti-queer legislations, and although things in the U.S. Or Canada aren't perfect, but at least there's room for more civil rights and and queer liberation compared to Russia. But is it more like, okay, this is how we chew gum and walk at the same time? I can denounce anti-queer legislations in Russia, but I'm not going to allow my grievances to be co-opted by big multinational corporations and arms companies to support a new Cold War on Russia and make Eastern Europe NATO NATO colonies.
Yeah, that's really what it comes down to, and it's the argument, the basic argument that I will make with every queer person that I know, which is that do not allow the state, the capitalist state, to use your oppression, your experience of oppression, to destroy another people. This is not what our struggle is about. Our struggle is about lifting people up and helping them find their way to a better world, not by using our grievances to destroy somebody or to hate other people. I've had enough. I've had a lifetime of hate. I'm done with it. So there's just the thing we need to find a way around is the efficiency of memorializing a country's tragedies. And I remember, we just got through Remembrance Day here. I don't know how much you know about the traditions of Remembrance Day in the United States and Canada and Great Britain. But every year we have this ceremony where the country is encouraged to honor the sacrifices of our military veterans for, and this is the official phrase now, for having defended our rights and freedoms. And I find it enormously depressing because so many of those veterans have been betrayed by their own state, first of all, and the ones that forget about them are their own state, not us. But then it gets harnessed to the service of creating this image of a really benevolent and important state that that doesn't stand for profit. No. It stands for your human rights. And in fact, it doesn't. But somehow people still get really emotional about it. And the hardest day I for me is when Remembrance Day comes around, and I make the point of saying that the First World War was not about democracy. You think it's about democracy, you forget who our allies were. Tsarist Russia, how much democracy was there? None.
Exactly.
If you look at the other side, the central powers, Germany probably had the most developed democracy of any country fighting in that war. So there's just all kinds of bullshit that's not based on any kind of historical fact. But then you see queer organizations, this is the homo-nationalism, wanting to celebrate the service of gay people who volunteered for these wars, even when they were being despised and oppressed at home. I also find that just really kind of distressing. The United States just named a new warship after Harvey Milk, right? I can't believe that Harvey Milk would approve of that kind of memorialization of his name. I just can't believe it.
And in Britain, they, I believe they pardoned. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name.
Alan Turing.
Yeah, they pardoned Alan Turing, but they've not pardoned all the millions of of homosexuals, lesbians, and bisexuals and trans who were persecuted throughout that entire period.
Yep. And also, like Section 28 in the British legal system was introduced by Margaret Thatcher, I don't know, in the late 80s. It fucked up the lives for so many gay,
And what was Section 28?
It was basically a new version of an anti-sodomy law in the UK. And it might have had to do with, I think, age of majority or something. I can't remember the details of it. But it was this homophobic law in the UK that just came out of nowhere and seemed to be going flying in the face of what everybody else was doing, right? It was also, by the way, at the height of the AIDS crisis, which lots of people forget about. We actually had to fight. We had to fight for our own state to engage in medical research to find either a cure or a vaccine for this, because they wouldn't do it. They just thought this is just a gay disease, and really the thing was, maybe we'll get lucky and it'll just kill off all the gays. I grew up with that kind of thinking,
Yeah.
And it wasn't really until it began to seep out into the straight community that it really became a priority to deal with the AIDS crisis.
Kind of reminds us of the ongoing coronavirus crisis, right?
It does. I get very frustrated with some people. I tell them, especially my straight acquaintances who are opposing masks and opposing vaccines, and I just say two things to them. I say, first of all, a mask is just another form of a what's the word I'm looking for? Contraceptive. Okay.
Exactly.
A mask is just a contraceptive, and if anybody knows about the importance of contraceptives, it's fucking gay men. So put your mask on. If we can do it when we're having intercourse, you can sure as hell do it when you're going to work, right?
And I would just say to the anti-maskers, the people who say that like hospital masks are very ineffective, I would just say to them, well, condoms aren't always effective, but we still use them if we don't want to catch it.
Yeah. I dare you to try and have sex with somebody that has STDs without using a condom because you think that it's not really effective. Go for it.
Unbelievable.
The other thing I say is that you have no idea how nice it is to actually have a state that cares enough about you to try and find a vaccine to prevent you from dying, because there's a whole cohort of people who survived the 1980s who didn't feel that kind of love, and guess what? We died. So the queer experience of the 1980s is actually really relevant to what's going on with the anti-maskers and the anti-vax thing. This would not, yeah.
And we're definitely going to return to that topic of the AIDS crisis. One final follow-up question on homo nationalism is how do you try to persuade a member of your community that even if you dislike the Islamic Republic of Iran's anti-queer attitudes, or the current Taliban government, or even the many anti-queer attitudes across Africa, the Middle East, and even Latin America, that it's not in a queer liberationist's interests, much like the feminist movement, in supporting any form of imperialism and militarism?
Well, look, my starting point is that first of all, it was our job. It was our job to deal with homophobia here at home. We weren't inviting anybody to bring their army into Canada or the United States to save us from homophobia. We did that shit, okay? And it wasn't easy. And it wasn't any better than what people face in a country like Iran. It really wasn't any better. When I was growing up in Alberta, you know what the standard therapy was for somebody who was gay? They sent you to a mental institute and tried to cure you with electroshock therapy. That's torture. I don't care what you want. That's torture. So we did that in the face of that reality every day, right? Somebody asked me the other day, why are gay men so promiscuous and unable to commit? And I say, because you're not thinking about the environment we grew up in. If you come out in your home, you run the risk of being thrown out, right? If you have a sexual relationship with somebody, you're going to have to put up with hatred, with potential beatings, with potential arrest, so it makes it really difficult to have meaningful, stable, long-term relationships when that's the environment that's surrounding you. So I'm not surprised at all that gay men tend to be promiscuous and have short-term sexual relationships, because that's the only space this culture left us. So don't condemn us for inhabiting that space. And if you want it to see it changed, then continue the fight for full equality so that we can actually have the same kinds of decisions you have. That's still the reality that we live in. There's still half of the kids on the street have kids who have been kicked out of their homes for being gay. So that's the first thing, is that we did it ourselves under duress and under enemy fire. I'm going to put it that way. The second thing is that it wasn't that bad. The homophobia in place like wasn't in Iran wasn't that bad until the 1950s. What happens in the 1950s? The British engineer a coup to overthrow the Republic of Iran and replace it with a monarchy, which then became extraordinarily oppressive to everybody, including homosexuals. So if you want and really care about the treatment of homosexuals in places like Iran, you have to fight against the imperialist agenda first. You have to get your own government to get out of the face of homosexuals in Iran, because I guarantee you that what homophobes will do in countries like Iran is play the treason card. You're straight. I mean, you're gay, and so you're a threat to the Islamic State. But that happens because imperialists want to push that agenda. They are happy to see the Islamic State in Iran ramping up its oppression. It makes them happy because it increases their pile of grievances against Iran, and one day they're going to cash that in for some kind of an airstrike or an invasion or some kind of embargo on Iran, which is in fact what has been happening now. They're ramping up for war. They will go to war if they get the chance to do it. And how do you suppose that's going to help the lives of homosexuals in Iran? It won't help them one little bit. What will help is a de-escalation of conflicts that allows them to have the political space to be able to have those struggles, those conversations in Iran. No country is going to loosen up everything when they're under an existential threat. And for whatever I think about the nature of the political state in Iran, the fact is they're facing existential threat.
Exactly.
You move forward when you're able to relax. And this is why the Soviets always pushed for détente. You relax those tensions so that people on all sides can pay attention to other more important matters like the quality of life of their citizens. But when you're constantly in a state of tension and you believe that you might get called up at any minute to fight a war, it's really hard to think about being magnanimous and forgiving and, and loving, because those aren't emotions that will help you win a conflict. And so to participate in the condemnation of a country like the Islamic State, just because they're homophobic, when this will contribute to the war rhetoric, this is not serving the interests of gay people in Iran. And that's that simple. But we get trained to be so loyal to a state that doesn't do us any good. That's what we're raised with from birth, and it's difficult to find a way through it. But that also is my job as a communist queer.
Perfect segue. That is a perfect segue then to this question, which is in the Afro-American community and much of the Black community, there's the issue of colorism. And can you talk about how, surprisingly, within the queer community, there is a lot of ostracization of bisexual folk, the bi-erasure movement, and even those within and outside the community who are transphobic and speak of LGB, but exclude the T's and the pluses. And how do you try to overcome that?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm trying to wrestle with it myself. So I'm just going to offer you some sort of provisional thoughts about that. I'll say, first of all, it feels to me very much like a pushback against the gains that particularly trans people had made since about maybe 2000 up into 2010, 2015. The last 5 or 6 years has seen this really rapid growth of transphobia, and it feels like the epicenter is probably in England right now.
Yeah, exactly. You have this sort of right wing, at times pseudo left, populist online magazine called Spiked Online, which engages a lot in transphobia. Then, of course, there's the issue of TERFs, J.K. Rowling, and others, and then this is and this is another issue I want to talk about, which is some on the left who talk about the LGB, or just the L and the G, but want to push aside trans rights and
So I think there's multiple historical roots for it. But at the end of the day, the most common element in all of it is adherence to a form of biological determinism, which is alien to Marxism, which basically says that you are what you are and you ain't what you ain't. So just get used to it and deal with it. Well, that is a really poor understanding of evolutionary biology. And so there really isn't a scientific foundation for that kind of determinism. It can only be argued by people who do not understand that human beings are actually a core part of the ecosphere. We're not separate and apart from the rest of the material world. So what does that mean? Well, we have evolved into beings who have the capacity to change the world with our hands. But and there's this artificial notion that somehow what human beings create is unnatural versus what's natural. So from that, they want to argue that that what's natural is the human body in whichever form you're given, and what's unnatural is the altering of that.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll stop wearing my glasses and I'll stop wearing my t-shirt, because none of that shit's natural. We weren't born with a t-shirt. We weren't born with glasses. We weren't born with cars. We weren't born with houses or any of the rest of it. The way we survive, our evolutionary edge, is the fact that we can build, we can create. That's natural. That's a part of our nature as human beings. So we also create genders. We also create a structure that guides the interaction of those genders. And we do that because it assists our survival and our advance as a species. And however, I don't even need to understand how and why people come to the point of realizing that their body is not in sync with their gender identity. And in order to have a happier life, they want to alter that. Why does anybody think that this is a bad thing? We do this all the time. We do it with people who have poor eyesight. You could just not get glasses. I was born with bad teeth. If we didn't have the capacity to create dentures, I'd have starved to death at a very young age. I'm entirely grateful to the capacity of human society to create new things, right? To respond to the challenges that they face. All this is a challenge of people being uncomfortable. And okay, you can subject them to, say, some kind of psychological therapy, some kind of conversion therapy. We already know that stuff doesn't work. All you're going to do is create more unhappiness with people, and that will lead to a bad end. And it will have a negative effect on other people who love them or who they have social relations with. So why not allow them the benefit of our creativity to become happier? This is what socialism is about, by the way. We want people to have better and happier lives. And so, yes, absolutely, 100%. A communist society is going to be all about matching people's gender identity with their physical appearance. And it should be kind of a bad joke, but it should be no skin off your nose when you do the reconstruction. So it's just, so why is it that say TERFs or transphobes are so invested? What are they really trying to protect? They're really trying to protect some really rigid sexual the sexual orientations and gender roles. And who were the last people to really insist on extremely rigid gender roles and sexual orientations? Catholic Church, corporations, Joseph McCarthy, all these people who really wanted to protect the patriarchy, really wanted to protect capitalism. So my argument is that if you're taking an anti-trans position, you're arguing for maintaining capitalist social relations. And there are a lot of unfortunately people on the left and even in communist parties who have not yet found their way clear, and they're really just responding to their own personal distaste. Well, nobody's asking you to marry a trans person. We're just asking you to allow us to be who we are. And for me, that means doing that in the Communist Party too. So
it's unbelievable. Yeah, it is quite unbelievable. And before I get to the before I get to that question, is it safe to say that those within the queer community and those all of the larger left, like my community of straight people, that this that this open-mindedness that they have towards gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, but the hostility towards trans people, is that basically, like, you don't get that sort of inner hatred without without rainbow capitalism and heteronormativity, like you don't get colorism without the racial caste system capitalism that comes out of the slave trade, the colonization of Africa, and the still ongoing apartheid that Black people everywhere live with, right?
There's a lot of this that bears an eerie familiarity to military strategies and tactics.
Divide and conquer.
If you're going to, and if you're going to do that, you never start with the strongest chess piece. You start with the weakest and most vulnerable, and then you begin cutting people away based on that. So if you were to take a look, if you were interested in putting the LGBTQ2SIA movement back in its place, where would you begin? You begin with not the people who have the greatest investments, like in terms of themselves, which I would say are well, I call them the dinks, double income, no kids. These are usually white cisgendered males, gay, but you're going to start with what you perceive as the smallest, most vulnerable group, which is least able to defend itself, and which might have the smallest number of allies within the community. In this case, we're talking about a handful of identities. So the trans identity is one, the intersex identity is the other, and the asexual identity is the third. And then I might move that up a little bit and say, eventually that's going to encompass, the bisexuals as well as lesbians, because they're mainly women who are still pretty vulnerable in bourgeois society. But that's what's happening. There is a campaign to push back the gains of the queer community, and it's beginning by dividing our ranks and picking off the most vulnerable, the most marginalized parts of the community. So I think it's really important, actually, for the queer community to reach deep within itself and to stand up. You stand up for each other, and this is how we're going to get through it, not by picking on one another. So, so I do think that that's what's happening, and it's quite deliberate. It's not incidental.
And that's a perfect segue. You already opened up this discussion, which is there's been a lot of intense and at times very toxic debates about identity politics versus the class struggle, and often and you mentioned that oftentimes even the most well-intentioned socialists, communists, and anti-imperialists, they'll often use this phrase, I don't want to talk about identity politics. It should all be about the class struggle and smashing institutional classism, capitalism. But oftentimes, that's basically oftentimes, I don't want to talk about identity politics has become code for I don't want to address institutional racism, patriarchy, transphobia, and queer liberation, xenophobia, and Romophobia. How do you overcome that and teach those often white cisgender communists and even those so how do you teach them how to chew gum and walk at the slay how to chew gum and walk at the same time and slay three evil birds with one stone, such a
I'm actually going to start from this argument as anti-identity politics argument is also linked to arguments that condemn intersectionality. And I want to start off by saying that there's two ways to approach identity politics and intersectionality. There is a revolutionary approach, and then there is a liberal approach. And most of what we get today is a liberal approach. People who are saying, I'm intersectional because I have these for ancestors, or I don't know, I'm gay and I'm something else, and so I'm intersectional, right? And this has never been the point of intersectionality. Intersectionality is about looking at an issue and seeing and understanding clearly who has an interest in the outcome. And I think Angela Davis really actually does a very good job of explaining this. And the way she links the struggle for gay rights with the struggle against racism, with the struggle against misogyny, and with solidarity with Palestine. There's intersections. They're all linked. And then why does that link matter? Because it forces you to look for the one thing that is making that link happen. And what makes it happen? Capitalism. So capitalism is responsible for the oppression of Palestinians. Capitalism is responsible for the oppression of Black people in the United States. Capitalism is responsible for the oppression of women and for the oppression of gay people. So this is what we have in common. This is why it's intersectional, and it's really the argument for people's unity. All right. This was the same problem that we faced in the 1930s as communists, and it was particularly acute in the United States. Particularly acute because of the key location of racism within capitalism. Racism was used to create a super exploited underclass of Black workers in the United States, primarily distributed throughout this, but not only throughout the Southern United States. And that was used to keep the union movement in its place too. And it would get overlaid with all kinds of oppressions that would be used to reinforce that. So, for example, the trial of the Scottsboro boys in the United States, 8 young men who were accused falsely of raping a white woman. Well, this wasn't strictly a class issue, was it? This was, or so it could have appeared. But what does it have the effect of doing in a place like Alabama? Does that go, if you're a white worker and you hear rumors about this trial and what these Black fellas did, how eager are you going to be to engage in an organizing drive of Black sharecroppers? It gets deliberately done in order to divide unity and to undermine the efforts of workers to better their lives. So we've got a job to do to actually point out that those connections actually exist. It's done not separately from exploitation in the workplace. It's part of it. So you engage in, and so who led the fight to prevent the Scottsboro boys from being executed? It's the Communist Party of the USA, right? They did the organizing, they raised the money, they found the lawyers, and then they sent the message out through all of their members who were in trade unions to bring the trade union movement on board, and they freed those guys. That was intersectional. And that was about how you deal with issues of racism, but you are clearly standing on a class perspective in the way that you understand it and the way that you approach it. So that's what we do. We don't ignore it. We look at the queer community and we say, where do we position ourselves as class conscious workers in that community? So for me, I organize. I've organized 2 unions. I work as a grievance officer, and I make goddamn sure that we police that contract, because my best protection as a worker in my workplace is a union contract. As a gay worker, it's a union contract. It's not some kind of gay rights enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights. It's going to be in my contract, because the leverage, the most important leverage I have, is my willingness to take my labor away from my employer. I'll go on strike.
Do you think those who who when they say I'm tired of wokeism, I'm tired of identity politics, which again I think that's code for I don't want to address institutional racism, I don't want to address the patriarchy, I don't want to address queer phobia, especially if it's trans. That those on on the left who engage and recycle those sexist, anti-queer attitudes and and racist attitudes, that basically that's that they basically just have transphobic blind spots, they have racist blind spots, or they're just or they just are racist and trans, and that the key is to basically try to not so much engage with those people, engage with the people who do know how to walk and chew gum at the same time, like those within the within the NDP Socialist Caucus, or yours truly, the Communist Party of Canada.
Yep. So I don't know. I try to think about it in the way that in the language of ordinary working class language. And when we're in bargaining, the question I always ask of our negotiators is, how much money are you leaving on the table for the boss? Are you just going for the easiest contract you can get and just go back to work, or do you want to try and get all the money that's available to you? How much money are you willing to leave on the table? And for me, the answer is none, because all that money that's on the table has come out of our labor.
Yeah,
it's ours to begin with, and it's just that we live in a shitty system where we have to negotiate about how much of it we get back. And it's the same thing. I ask. So if you're talking to me about why should I be concerned about wokeism or ID politics or all the rest of it, it's the same question. How much of our community are you willing to leave on the table so that you get something better? How many people are you willing to sell out so that you're okay? You're telling me you're willing to sell out people because of who they love or what their skin color looks like? And if that's what you're willing to do, you can't be trusted in a revolutionary movement.
Exactly.
I guarantee you, the secret police or the boss are going to come to you with enough money to buy you.
And would you say to some of those socialists who claim that they're all for that they're all for trans rights, but they just don't want to make it into a big issue. They don't want it on their Labor Party platform. Mm-hmm. Would you? I mean, would you say to those people, okay, well then just be honest. Just say that you're for the white working class, the white cisgender working class, and just be honest. And me and my people, the left movements that I'm part of, we're for
acceptable left.
We're for slaying all of the injustices in one go.
Yes. Yep. The best slogan in the world came out of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And I'll always remember it. It's from the South African Congress of Trade Unions. An injury to one is an injury to all. So if somebody is screwing somebody because they're trans, and I turn a blind eye to it, and they get to run over trans people and nobody steps up, they're just going to go after the next one in the line until they get to the end of it. And at the end of it are the more privileged members of the working class, and you're going to get plowed in too. So if you don't believe that an injury to one is an injury to all, then you just get to go on your own merry, selfish way. And you're just not going to, that road is actually pretty short. Okay. I know I'm on a long road. That's fine with me. because it's gonna be room for a lot more of us on that road too. So take your time, but make sure you don't leave anybody behind. So exactly. That's it. We are in a class war, and you have to behave just the same that way as you're in a shooting war. You have to fight. If you're going to survive, you have to fight for the person who's standing beside you. That's your hope for survival. And if you start leaving people behind, eventually somebody's going to say, that person is dead weight, we're leaving him behind too. The only way they're going to carry you along is if they think that you're going to be of value and use somewhere down the road. And what is that value and use? That means you're going to stand up and join the fight.
And this is a bit off topic, but since it's Thanksgiving Day, Thanksgiving Day in the United States, and I know that the Indigenous anti-colonial struggle, it's quite advanced to a high level of consciousness in Canada, where people talk about this. There's land acknowledgements, and whether it's Black Lives Matter, queer liberation, the Communist Party of Canada, the rights of Indigenous people, and addressing the original sin of settler colonialism and capitalism is baked in the salt of the Canadian left. Why, do you think in the U.S. The rights of Indigenous people and their struggle will ever get to that conscious level of queer liberation, the immigrant rights, the Latino civil rights movement, or the Black liberation struggle?
Well, are you asking me about the U.S. or Canada?
The U.S. Do you think the struggle for Indigenous people will ever get to the level that is in Canada or New Zealand or even Australia?
Okay. Yeah. I hear you. Yeah. Well, I'm a historian, and so I can only tell you what I know about the past and the present. So the future is always up for grabs. So that's my starting point. So the answer for me is that potentially yes, and then not just potentially yes, but actually eventually it has to, unless you're prepared to allow the continuation of what really is a process of genocide in the USA. So the more that Indigenous lands are denied and people the U.S. continues to oppress, they're working on, they talk about assimilation, but assimilation is really just genocide, because you wake up the next morning and you're not the same person you were yesterday, and you don't have the same community because it's gone. And that's really what Indigenous people are up against, both in Canada and the United States, New Zealand, Australia, everywhere we find settler colonialism, it's the same. In the United States, I don't know. I think that country's in an existential crisis, to be perfectly honest. And it's becoming harder and harder to think that the experiment based on their constitution is ever going to come to fruition. I just can't see it anymore. So, and I think that it's going to be, my guess is that it's going to end up being an intrinsic part of the struggle for a transformation of the United States, and then it will have to include coming to terms with whose land you're on. And I think that I say this because here in Nova Scotia, where I live, none of the land was ever seceded. None of it. There was never a treaty that surrendered this land. There was never a treaty that surrendered any of the land in British Columbia. There have been land surrender treaties in other parts of the country, but even then, it was there are limits to that. And one of the slogans that's now beginning to emerge is "land back."
Yeah.
you cannot address the problem of genocide without addressing the issue of a land base, and that's starting to emerge in the U.S. too, I think, and we're seeing it in some areas. But there is most definitely an assertion of sovereignty that's new, I think. It feels new to me. We saw initial uptick in the 1960s and 1970s with the American Indian movement. But I think it's becoming revived, and this was particularly clear during the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle with the Sioux people, and I mean they stopped it. That's new. That's really new. The success of an Indigenous struggle that size, actually winning and taking on a corporation of that size. It happened because Indigenous communities were prepared to mobilize, but there was also, I think, a new level of support coming from the settler community as well. So people are beginning to understand what the game really is. And so we have a job of pushing that along and helping people to come to a higher level of consciousness. And that's really, really what it will be about, is how do you elevate the consciousness of the population? That's a hard one too, because I don't know any settler state that has a more deeply entrenched and efficient system of indoctrination than the United States does. I mean, holy shit. So it's hard. It's really, really hard. But I see people using the term comrades really, really broadly. I see comrades taking that job on, and it may sound funny in some ways, but now we have a job, those of us who aren't in the imperial core, to offer our support and solidarity to our comrades who are up against the machine, inside the very machine that we're trying to defeat. So. And one of the most important ones now is the land back movement, because really that exposes everything. When you think about land back and what it implies and what it's going to involve and why it's a just demand, you really have to start thinking about the origins and the nature of the history of the United States to argue that one out. And it's having that same effect here in Canada too. So.
Here's hoping that the anti-imperialist movement of the U.S. Reach, that Canada gets to that level, and then here's hoping that in the U.S. the Indigenous anti-colonial movement reaches the level that it is in Canada.
Yeah, or Chile for that matter. It's I don't know. I do think you were right in calling it the original sin, and it is the very thing that I think has I don't know. I just think it's been like a really toxic presence ever since, and we haven't noticed it. I think as settlers, I mean, I think about myself as a settler. I would tell you just a little story, about how all of this is causing people to rethink a lot about themselves here, because I've been going through that when I think about my own family's history. So I was raised with this narrative about your family are Scandinavian on the one side, and they're Irish and Scots on the other side. And, we came here and we settled the land in the West and cleared northern Saskatchewan. The Depression came, and then we get shipped off to work in the logging camps on Vancouver Island, but we persisted. We made unions, we built unions. And then my dad works on various resource projects while I'm going up. And then, so this is a story of resilience and survival and all the rest of it, which I think is probably true. But the one thing that's missing from that entire story is who else was on that land when my parents were busy settling Canada. So I've been thinking, I did my own research, and the fact is that when my grandparents settled homesteaded in northern Saskatchewan, they were doing it on land that had been cleared of Cree people. When they moved to Vancouver Island to do logging and work in mill towns, sure, they had to organize unions, but they were doing it on lands that had been cleared of the Indigenous population, and they had been forced into reservations and into residential schools. When my dad was working on the Trans Mountain Pipeline in northern BC. That was the highway of death, which is infamous for the deaths, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, but that's part of my story now too. When my parents moved to northern Manitoba to work on the hydroelectric project at what the heck, I can't try to remember the name of it now, Grand Rapids. They displaced an entire Indigenous village and then flooded their valley in order to build the dam. Which then, there's not one element of my own personal life and my family's history that hasn't happened at the expense of Indigenous people in this country. So
and I think what you're trying to say, what you're trying to get to the heart of, is that reconciliation is not possible without justice for Indigenous justice for Indigenous people. And one of the things I love about the Communist Party of Canada, I remember when I first interviewed your central organizer, Jay Watts, when I asked him, how would the Communist Party deal with the grievances of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people, Jay Watts was saying, well, we would love to abolish the Senate and have a constitutional assembly similar to what Venezuela has and other Latin American countries. But if whatever Indigenous community wants the right to secede from the Federation, we would give them that. And that really is almost and for me, that is true self-determination. And what John Pilger would often say, which is nothing will change until we right the wrongs of the bloody past. Or until we give them back their nationhood, we can never claim our own, right?
Exactly right. We can never be a healed nation unless we confront the realities of our history. And this has to happen at a very individual level too. I can't go on living on just myths, right? That is just a lie. And then that compromises me as a communist. So you have to be really, I don't know, just fearless about coming to grips with those kinds of histories. And then the second thing is that, it's one thing that I've learned through my involvement with the feminist movement and the queer community is the importance of consent, the critical and absolutely central importance of consent. And my question, when people are saying, they're arguing about, well, what's this land back thing? And I just say to them, would you ever consider having sex with somebody without consent? And the answer is no, because that's rape.
Exactly.
And that's what happened here with land and with Indigenous people. There was no consent to any of this. They didn't get a chance to say yes or no. So as communists, if we're serious about building something new here, it has to start with consent. You either want to belong to our project or don't. And if you don't, then we will sort that out. We cannot afford to begin building a social society that hasn't come to terms with the original sin of Canada, which is the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. And sometimes the terms of settling that are going to be hard to bear. But at the end of the day, the outcome will be better.
I completely agree. My second to last question is, can you enlighten our audience about the ACT UP Fight AIDS movement in the US? And how was it in Canada, and how did it radically change the attitudes, not just for AIDS patients, but the fight for single-payer healthcare in the US and the movement for pharmacare in Canada?
Well, politically, it was one of the bravest struggles I've ever witnessed, and I kind of wish I'd have been more directly involved. But I was certainly aware of it, and it influenced my own activism in very significant ways. It probably didn't reach the same level of intensity in Canada that it did in the United States. That has to do with the nature of the beast and also scale. So there's just a lot more activists because of sheer scale. But they were also up against a far more homophobic political institution as well. So at least in Canada, we were able to operate on the understanding that theoretically, we had been decriminalized. I'm not going to say made equal, but we had been decriminalized. the bigger impacts is that we still suffer from some of the aftershocks actually of that intensity, and it still surprises me how it reflects itself in some very unexpected ways. You know, I had to bury my dad in 2005, and so I went back to Alberta to do that. And his last dying wish was to have been cremated and his ashes scattered over his favorite spot in Alberta. And I got there to find out it was illegal to do that. And so I asked why. Why is that illegal? And they say, well, it was made illegal during the AIDS crisis in Alberta because they were so afraid that a gay person might get cremated and that spreading his ashes might spread the disease. So we still have little things like that are still embedded in legislation that were totally a response to the ignorance and fear of the AIDS crisis. On the other hand, I know in Canada, I think it at the end of the day, well, it was pretty rough actually, because at first a lot of the queer community was nervous about being associated with the ACT UP movement because it seemed so over the top, too militant. That it would alienate people rather than bring them on board. But they had to be encouraged to understand that we were already too much, even without the AIDS crisis. I mean, just look around. So what do you actually have to lose? So what that movement did was to shed its fear of being labeled unrespectable, because we were already not respectable. So the only strategy left for you is to really just get into the face of the political class until they can't stand it anymore, and act. That's really what it was. And that's just returning to our activist roots, which is what happened in the 1960s and the 1970s, was that level of activism. Because this claim, that's the evil thing of this claim of decriminalization, it deflated the movement, because a lot of people thought, well, we've already achieved what we needed to achieve. So it sustained the history and tradition of militant resistance in the queer community, is what it did. And I think it did that in the United States too. And even to a larger scale, there were very few things more moving for me to see when they finished the quilt project, the AIDS quilt project.
Yeah,
and they laid that thing out in the mall in Washington, and it just was such a stunning visual depiction of the depth and the extent of the AIDS crisis, and the sorrow and the sadness, but also the hope, because people don't do that shit unless they're filled with hope and a determination to keep going. And that really sent a very strong message to me. And I think it was symbolic of where ACT UP had led that movement to, which was to expand out well beyond just a gay movement, because now it involved the mothers and the fathers and the brothers and the sisters and the communities that you grew up in, and the people who knew that individual. Maybe they didn't understand or even approve of their sexual orientation, but a lot of really wonderful, talented, beautiful people were taken needlessly by that crisis. And I think that's what people were left with. And so they began to understand the horror of it, and there is a desire not to go there again. So this is what forced governments to begin acting. And it's still been a long time coming, but I do think it helped to set the stage for a struggle for universal health care, and you see people's criticisms, even in Canada, where we have some degree of coverage, but people have come to understand just how critically important it is to have access to decent health care, because if we don't, we're going to be continually struck with tragedies that will leave enormous holes in families, in society, and it will compromise our creative capacity. So these things, we played that role, and the ACT UP movement played that role. It was critically important, and it's something that we should continue to honor. One last legacy from all that, and it's still happening, and it's in my practice today. And it's about how you organize those kinds of protests effectively, and It was 2 summers ago, I guess. Yeah, it was 2 summers ago when the Black Lives Matter movement emerged around the murder of George Floyd, and it became really a continental, maybe even a global movement.
Oh, yeah, it definitely was. Yeah.
In my small town of Antigonish, okay, we've got a permanent population of about 4,500 to 5,000 people. So it's not really very big. In the county as a whole, there's about 20,000. And there were 2 students who had initiated that. They wanted to do something in Antigonish, and they were both soccer players. And they decided this on a Sunday, contacted some people in the community. And then they tell me, this is the story afterwards, that we realized we were in over our heads. And so we needed some help. And everybody said, call Chris. So they did. So they called me on Tuesday, and the march was planned for the Saturday. And so I said, I know how to organize protests. I've been doing this my whole life. So there are just a few things you're going to have to do, and right, you need to get clear on what your goal is, all the rest of it. And then I said, but the most important thing is that, one, you can't have any police at this march. Can't have any police. And I already knew it was going to be huge. There was a Facebook group just for that march that had thousands of people in it. And I think there'd never been a protest bigger than 200 or 300 people in Antigonish. And I said, you better be prepared. We need to be prepared for the way people are responding to this. So no police, but if you're not having police, then we have to be able to control what happens in that protest. And first of all, is that we're going to take downtown. It will be hours for the day. And then we're going to get everybody through it without incident and back safely to the jump off and the end point. So I said, okay, I will take a responsibility for ensuring the safety of this march. That means I'm going to have to train a security detail of safety marshals. So we had 24 safety marshals. None of them had done this kind of thing before. I trained them. We spent days training. So by the time that day came, we knew what we were doing. We took control of every intersection through town. We took the entire street. We weren't marching on no sidewalks. Went through the whole thing and got back safely. But here's the thing, is that how did I know how to do this? Well, I had been trained in organizing protests through ACT UP.
Wow.
They had the most efficient system of training safety marshals that I have ever seen in my life. So it was all their playbook. It was all their playbook. But it helped us put 4,000 people in the streets in a town of 4,000. 4,000 people. It was 25% of the entire population of the county. No police. We took every intersection, tied them down, got that entire march around town and back to the stop. I had the town officials tell me that they had never seen anything like it in their lives. They wanted to hire my team to run other events. But that is also part of the legacy of ACT UP. And this is also, we'll come back to the issue of intersectionality, Youri, because this is a Black Lives Matter march being organized by a white queer guy who's relying on the experience of the ACT UP protests in the 1980s. And I'm a labor guy and a communist. So there it is, all in one bundle. That's intersectionality. Yeah.
That's simply incredible. Before I close this interview, Chris, I want to do this quick questionnaire with you, sure, because I think you definitely earned it. So, Chris, in memory of James Lipton, what is your favorite word?
My favorite words?
Yeah, favorite words.
My favorite word. Communist.
What is your least favorite word?
Capitalist.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
The struggle.
What turns you off?
Apathy.
What is your favorite curse word?
Fuck.
What sound or noise do you love?
Victory.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Defeat.
What profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
Oh, I'd like to be a performer full time.
What profession would you not like to do under any circumstances?
Be a CEO.
I agree with that one. And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I'm dead, but you can stay.
Well, if there is a God, he / she would have a very wicked sense of humor. So, so on this edition of 1+1, we were joined by Chris Frazer, an educator by day, a drag reformer by night, a member of the Communist Party of Canada, who has become one of my favorite flaming left-wingers. Chris, I hope this will be the first of many conversations I have with you. But until then, you have a great weekend, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Youri, and thank you for your patience with me.
No problem.
It's been a lot of fun. Yeah, thank you. This is a great thing. Thank you.
Likewise.